Thank you, Professor Brachtendorf, for your very inspiring lecture. Actually, I have two questions for you. Number one, both has to do with your interpretation of St. Thomas' view. The first one is a rather simple one. I heard you said that for St. Thomas, passion is the intention of the will. So I'm interested to know about the relationship between passion and the will. That's my first question. And the second one, maybe it's just a comment. When you compare St. Augustine's view and St. Thomas' view with regard to Jesus' passion, I prefer the Augustinian one to the St. Thomas one. Because St. Thomas' view, as you presented it, seems to me a reduction of passion to reason. And in this way, it undermines the true humanity of Jesus. Jesus seemed to be just pretending to be a human being and suffer everything in order to teach we humans. Well, this image of Jesus may fit very well with the image of Jesus as the sovereign king in the Gospel of John. But do you think this image can harmonize with other images portrayed in, say, the Gospel of Mark? These are two of my questions.
Thank you very much for these questions. The distinction between passion and will in Aquinas basically comes from his distinction in our faculties of desiring, because there is the appetitus rationalis, so it's reasonable desire. That's what he calls voluntas. So that's will means always rational desiring. And on the other side, there is the appetitus sensitivus, the sensual appetite. It's the form of desiring that we share with the animals, for example. So, and that's where the passions come from. So, and Aquinas has more sub distinctions in it. He's very big in classifying all the passions and what are the mental faculties, where they come from. But that's the most important distinction. So there's the appetitus rationalis, rational appetite, and sensual appetite. And that corresponds to the distinction between will as voluntas, which is rational desire, and passion as irrational desire. For your second question, I too prefer Augustine to Aquinas, but for different reasons. That objection, it sounds as if Jesus was just making it up, so he was just pretending to have passions. That objection, if it were justified, it would hit them both, because they both have the idea that there is something like that Jesus in his power, at his potestas, as it is in Latin, that Jesus' power is strong enough to summon up these passions in himself. That, of course, it sounds to us a little bit like an actor on stage. I think good actors can do that, so they can summon up passions in themselves, so they are very convincing in what they show to the audience, but still we think it's a sort of pretending. I think Augustine and Aquinas hold the same view in this point. It is a sign of our weakness that the passions come over us, and it is a sign of Christ's power that passions do not come over him, but he can summon them by his own decision. So I think the difference between Aquinas and Augustine is not in this regard. So they both claim that Jesus did feel these passions. Summoning them up does not mean he did not really feel them. He was really sad. And as Thomas is eager to point out, he was even sadder than any human being could possibly be. So he suffered really the maximum of sadness. He really felt it, but by his own decision. So that is where they are in harmony, Augustine and Aquinas. The difference, I think, is that Augustine puts more emphasis on the question, why did Christ do that? And then Augustine explains extensively, he did this for our sake. So he used his own power to make himself weak, so he is on our level, so to speak. So we have somebody to look at, the Son of God, to look at when we despair in our fear of death. And that existential reasoning, that is not to be found in Aquinas, but it is very strong in Augustine. And I think it has to do with the fact that Augustine also was a pastor, whereas Aquinas was a professor. So Aquinas was just a professor, he was an academic, but Augustine had to deal with the people every day. So he was a pastor and he saw them dying and fearing death. So he may have known more about that, and that's why he could better explain what Christ did to us in these terms, in the terms that the ordinary people need.
Thank you, Professor, for your very enlightening lecture. As I listen to your lecture, I find out that passion in Augustine or in St. Thomas are always treated at best as some kind of instrument. They are to be subordinate to reason, they are to be under control, or even they should be summoned at times. As if passion is given merely under reason. However, like nowadays theology, we emphasize very much theology of the body, which is as important as the soul. Although we take precedence now, we sometimes sacrifice the body, save the soul, because the soul will never die. To say you sacrifice the body or to give rise or to the virtue of the soul, it does not. It's simply another way of saying that the body, in fact, saved your soul. What I mean is, so is it better simply, which is better, to take the passions merely as under, or I have an idea, I hope it will not be so provocative or so, I would like to compare passions and the soul as a kind of husband and wife. The wife has their own initiative. No, let's say husband. Husband,
who is the husband then?
The passion.
The passion is the husband.
Let's compare passion as husband. So so let's compare reason as the wife. The husband is not simply subordinate to the wife, but has their own initiative. So it might appear better, like even in St. Augustine's interpretation, if the passions are given by God, not simply as to be used, but has their own a kind of initiative that even initiates the soul to accomplish the good. Not simply as fallen, but to be controlled, to be dominated. How do we see these passions here? Will it be better if we take passion to be more elegant That's my question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That, of course, is a very big question, and I can only try to say a few things about that. You started saying that in Augustine and Aquinas, the passions are rather treated like an instrument. But I don't think that is the case. I think they are treated as a challenge. They are treated as a challenge. Because on the one hand, they are part of human nature, and that is what Augustine makes very clear against the Stoics. Because the Stoics said human beings should be, in the ideal case, human beings should be without passions, just reason. So, and Augustine, he argues against that, because he says that is the wrong view of the human being. Passions are part of human nature. And as such, they still are a challenge. So for Augustine and Aquinas and many thinkers after them until, let's say, until the early 20th century, when the theology of the body and these things came up, but until early 20th century, it was always clear that passions, being part of human nature, need guidance. They need guidance by reason. And it's reason's responsibility to guide the passions and also to restrain the passions to a proper measure, because the passions always tend to exceed. And so it's reason's task, reason's responsibility to guide and restrain the passions. Now, if you want to challenge that view, you have to challenge it at this point, I would say. Should reason truly be the guide of passions, or should the passions be the guide for reason? So, for at least I can say this much, that for Augustine and Aquinas and Kant and all the philosophical tradition until, let's say, the early 20th century, it was very clear that reason is the superior faculty and has to guide the passions, and that has to do also with the will as rational desire, because only rational desire should determine our actions, because only then our actions would be morally correct. Otherwise, if they are guided by reason, they might be morally incorrect. We might act morally badly if we are guided by our desires. Now, Augustine, other than, or let's say contrary to late ancient Platonism, for example, Augustine is quite friendly to the body. So I know that Augustine has a different reputation. So many think, well, Aquinas brought this up about the soul being the form of the body and all the body friendliness that comes with that. But I think that view is incorrect. Augustine always argues against the Neoplatonists, especially Porphyry, because the Platonists, they claim we can be happy only without the body, because the body causes us trouble, pain, hunger, thirst, sickness, all that. And the Platonists said the body causes us trouble, so there is no happiness for the human soul with the body. The soul needs to be separated from the body to become happy. Now, Augustine, being a Christian thinker, he always adopts that doctrine of bodily resurrection. And he explains, well, the soul, even in the afterlife, needs the body to be complete. Without the body, the soul wouldn't be ultimately happy, even if it sees God. Even in the vision of God, the soul would still miss something, as long as it misses its body. So it's only after bodily resurrection of the flesh, that the soul becomes ultimately happy. So that strand of thinking is already there in Augustine. And there are certain passages where he's very friendly to a holistic view of the human being that includes the body, not only the soul. But still, so even then he thinks the passions always have to be under the guidance of reason. So Augustine says passions are good if the will is good. So, and the will in his sense means the basic orientation of the human being. If the human being's basic orientation is towards love God more than anything else, then all the passions will be good passions. But if the basic orientation of the will is wrong, voluntas perversa, so if a human being loves itself more than anything else, then all the passions will be morally bad. So the passions do have a moral character, but their moral quality depends on the orientation of the will. So if the will is good, the passions will be good. If the will is perverted, the passions will be perverted.
Very, very good. Thank you very much for. In fact, my question comes from my own background. The explanation, I understand very well that Thomas and Augustine takes passion positively. What I mean, because while I'm listening to your lecture, I'm also thinking. I have written about the Trinity, St. Thomas' view about Trinity. I'm still thinking like the Son, the Spirit, and the Father. Somehow, we say that the Spirit proceeds from both the Father and the Son. However, the Spirit leads to the truth. And if still, let's argue from the other side, we are saved, human beings are saved by an accident. We call it grace. Grace is an accident treated by Thomas. If passion is somehow an accident also of human beings, sometimes if they are really like becomes instruments of the Holy Spirit, become promptings of the Holy Spirit, they might be, even the passions might become, let's say, instruments of salvation for them. Besides, St. Thomas also says, to see where your vocation is, you discern where is your pleasure or where is your interest. Mm-hmm. And in that way, and another thing is that if we understand the Gethsemane scene from the background of the Father, Spirit, and Son, somehow the teaching there is not simply I let my passion grow and then I subdue it. Not like that. It might be better if we see that somehow the passion also has a kind of lead, like the Holy Spirit, and the Son is there. I don't know how to express it very well. That's the direction. Yeah. The teaching there is not simply I let it grow and I subdue it. Rather, it's really, maybe Christ is teaching us that your passion has a lead sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Of course, a lot could be said about this. But this goes very deep into Trinitarian theology, and of course there's all for Augustine and for Aquinas. It is very clear that one has to make a distinction between the immanent Trinity and the economical Trinity. So I know in modern theology, in 20th century theology, it's not so clear whether this distinction should still be made, like in Karl Rahner, for example, who said we should identify these. The immanent Trinity is the economical Trinity. But for Augustine and Aquinas, this would be impossible to accept, because they would say we have the eternal inner Trinitarian relations, and then we have the work of redemption in history. So, and these are two different topics. So, and we shouldn't conflate these. That's what I can say to this at the moment.
Thank you, Professor, for your comparison between Socrates and Jesus. But if we look into into the background of the Greek ideology, they believe that the soul is bound by the body. So when Socrates is going to die, he's doing an act to tell his people that don't cry for me, just like Jesus tell his fellow disciple that I'm sorrowing for you because I know what is going to happen. And in the Chinese saying, if we inculturate into the Chinese, there's a saying that those who are the sages, they will be worrying about everything before the world start to worry. And they will be happy after everyone else was happy.
Can you say that again, please? That saying?
Oh, the wise man will always worry ahead of the world. And then he will be happy only after everyone was happy. It is just similar to what Christ is looking for in us. Because he would not be happy until every one of us was saved. And he will be worrying that we are going to fall and put into hell. So that's why I think the comparison, if you go into the Chinese culture, maybe make it better comparison to what Jesus is looking for in his teaching.
Yeah.
That's what my silly suggestion.
Yes. Thank you very much. Did Jesus worry before everybody else? Yes, he did. He very much worried about us and how we will behave in the face of death. So he certainly worried before us and tried to take care of us even in advance, because he knows our infirmity and our weakness, and he knows what will happen when we have to face death. So in that regard, certainly Jesus is like the sage in the Chinese saying about being happy after everybody. Certainly one can make some Christian truth about this as well. I think so. But the interesting difference that I find between Socrates and Jesus is the scenes of dying. They are very parallel, but what the teacher teaches or how the teacher acts seems to be so different. And these authors like Aquinas and Augustine, of course they knew Plato, and they knew that ideal, Socrates, the wise man that never weeps. They knew that ideal, and they thought about how does Christ relate to, how does Christ compare to that? And then they think, on the one hand, Christ could not have been morally inferior to Socrates. Christ could not have been weaker in character than Socrates, because Christ was the perfect human being. He was a human being. He was God and a human being, and as far as he was a human being, he was a perfect human being. So he's a model for us. But then why did he weep so excessively? And I think there the idea, what distinguishes Christianity from ancient philosophy in this regard, I think, is the thought that we will inevitably fail morally. We will all fail morally in the face of death. So I think the Christian teaching has a better sense of what we are as human beings. So the ancient philosophy is too optimistic about the strength that we human beings can muster in decisive situations. So Christianity knows that we are weak and that we need help in our weakness. So not just admonishing, but we need comfort because we cannot do the right thing even though we are admonished to do the right thing. So I think that is what makes Christ superior to Socrates in Augustine's view and also in Aquinas' view.
Professor, you just mentioned something about the hermeneutical situation of Thomas and Augustine's interpretation of Jesus' sorrow. That is the comparison between Jesus and Socrates. Do you think it is due to this comparison that both Augustine and Aquinas has such an intellectual interpretation of passion? And if this is true, then do you think it is the reason why over so many years there has not been a theology of body in the church? Because reason has to rule over the body. It's very close to a Platonic view of the human person, actually. And even the theology we have now could be even just a disguised theology of reason. What do you think?
Well, I think that the questions that were raised in ancient philosophy and the basic concepts that were developed in ancient philosophy still are valid in the view of Augustine and Aquinas. So I think that the coordinates of thinking and the basic concept, Augustine takes this over from ancient philosophy. To some extent he's a Platonist in the metaphysical sense, for example. In anthropology to some extent. And that is certainly true for Thomas Aquinas, being an Aristotelian, but also having many theories from Neoplatonism. I think he also is a Platonist, not just an Aristotelian. So the basic concepts and the basic ideas of ancient philosophy are still valid for Augustine and Aquinas, and they try to formulate their theology, and they try to explain what the gospel means to us and what it says to us. They try to explain that within the coordinates that were given by ancient philosophy. Now, one may think that this was a mistake, and I mean that theology of the human body and these things, it's no accident they came up in 20th century when the philosophical critique of metaphysics became very strong. In Germany it became very strong through Immanuel Kant, later through Heidegger and the phenomenological movement. And for Heidegger it was very clear that metaphysics, especially ancient metaphysics, was a mistake, or it was short-sighted, it didn't see the true reason for it. It gave an insufficient explanation of the human being. So the anthropology, especially of animal rationale, is insufficient. So the human being is much more than that, they claim. So I agree with you that Augustine and Aquinas think to some extent, within the framework that was given by ancient philosophy. They also break through it at certain points. You see where the Christian teaching breaks through ancient thinking. But in other respects, Christian teaching remains within the boundary of ancient thinking. So that is certainly so. But and from there stems the question that drives them on, the question, how can we make sense of Jesus' words in the Garden of Gethsemane? How can we make sense of that if this was the Son of God? So how could he say that? That's the biggest challenge for them. And they found their way of interpreting that by saying, well, Christ was for a moment set reason aside and let somebody else speak, and so on. That may not be very convincing as a solution in biblical theology. So it certainly means they use the distinction between reason and passions and all that. They use that distinction, which is not really biblical, although it may certainly be found somewhere in the Bible. They use that distinction to explain the gospel. If you don't want that, if you reject that, then please find another explanation for what Jesus said in the Garden of Gethsemane. So an explanation that makes sense within the framework of Christian belief. When we speak about theology of the body, I think we should be very specific about what theology of the body we mean here, because Augustine and Aquinas do have a theology of the body. They do have that. It's not like they don't say anything about the body. The body was created by God as the human mind was created by God. The body is an integral part of the human being. The body is not just an obstacle to human happiness, although it has deteriorated through the effects of original sin. Sickness and dying and all that would not have happened in paradise. So it is deteriorated now, but it will be resurrected, it will be perfected. We will have perfect bodies in the afterlife, not these weak bodies that we have now. So there is a theology of the human body in traditional theology. Only it is a theology that says the human mind is the most superior faculty in the human being, and everything else is superior to the human, at least in the perfect human being. In the sinner, it's the other way around. The sinner is driven by the passions and therefore acts morally bad. So they do have a theology of the body, only they don't have the theology of the body that is, as the other colleague indicated earlier, as the body being, let's say, our true means to get in touch with the reality, the prime instance in us that should govern us in our life. So Aquinas and Aristotle don't think that.
My question is actually out of ignorance. Yeah. Recent scholarship on Augustine's theology, they are interested in the role of the Holy Spirit, especially in how to motivating humans' will and passion, or how to unite humans' will and passion towards the love of God. I just wonder whether when he talk about sorrow, whether there is a role of Holy Spirit in there, or just the Christ's exemplary role for human consolation. Yeah.
Well, I think within the limits of that topic, like sorrow and how to deal with sorrow, Jesus Christ is most important because he teaches us how we should be sorrowful and what about we should be sorrowful, and he helps us overcome our weakness when we are most sorrowful and are in danger to despair about our being sorrowful and despair about salvation. So there Jesus Christ is most important. I would say the Holy Spirit, where does the Holy Spirit come into play here? The Holy Spirit, I think, comes into play when it is about the question, how can we change from a perverted will that engenders bad passions to a righteous will, voluntas recta, that engenders good passions? So conversion, actually it's about conversion, the moral change of a person. So of course it is only through that moral change, only through conversion, that we become able to have good passions and to have them in the right measure and not too much of it. So it's only through conversion. And conversion, of course, for us humans is only possible through God's grace. That's for Augustine, it's his famous doctrine of grace. It's not possible through our own power, it's only through God's grace. And the Holy Spirit, of course, then plays an important role in the process of conversion. So God's grace is given to us through the Holy Spirit. I think that's where the Holy Spirit comes into place.
I myself a very simple question. Very often, sorrows are caused by the others or by the situation. Is there anything in Augustine and Aquinas about self-inflicted sorrows?
Like, have you an example?
Well, we used to have disciplines, in formation. For example, nowadays we are not allowed to do it anymore. Discipline, beating yourself, self-inflicted. Is there anything in Augustine and Aquinas about that? That kind of suffering?
Suffering that we deserve and that also leads us to becoming better, that leads us to betterment.
That kind of discipline, is there any value anymore?
For Augustine it is, yes, very much so, very much so. I mean, this is a very big topic in Augustine, and it has to do with the exertion of violence. That's the bigger framework to that, the exertion of violence. So when a teacher hits a student, that's a form of violence. When the police arrests you for some wrongdoing, it's a form of violence. When a state fights against another state in war, these are all forms of violence. And Augustine thinks a lot about what justification there could be for violence. And of course he asks about the questions, are Christians allowed to exert violence? Because the Sermon on the Mount seems to forbid that. So, but then it's part of our daily practice in education, maybe not so much so in these days, but in earlier days it is. But it is so in how the state acts in punishing criminals, and how the states act when they wage war. And are Christians allowed to take part in that, either as teachers or as executioners for the state when it's about capital punishment, or as soldiers? Are they allowed to fight against enemies? And Augustine he states certain conditions about that, and he says, well, generally speaking, the Sermon on the Mount should not be taken literal in this sense. It does not forbid generally any exertion of violence, but it demands us to do this in the right manner and with the right intention. He calls this preparatio cordis, so preparation of the heart. Your heart needs to be prepared before you exert violence. And that includes on the side of the person that has to suffer that violence. It presupposes that there is some real wrongdoing that has happened, and also it means that person should profit from the violence it experiences. So if there's some wrongdoing, that person self-induces violence. It demands violence, so to speak. But that violence should always be for the betterment of the person that is concerned. So that means, for example, Augustine always was against capital punishment. He often writes that in his letters. Although that was common practice at his time, of course, capital punishment, but Augustine often writes letters to the top officials in his province and says, well, don't exert it in this case, because capital punishment takes away from the victim the chance for betterment. If you kill someone, that person can't become better anymore. So Augustine thinks that's an unjustified form of exerting violence. But then another example is the servant to the high priest in the Passions, and story of the Passion, that spanked Jesus when he gave that answer to the high priest, and the servant spanked him. And Augustine points out, in that occasion, Jesus did not offer the other cheek, like he said in the Sermon on the Mount. He did not do that. But he challenged that servant and said, why did you beat me? So if it was right to beat me, then prove it. Otherwise, why did you hit me? Why did Christ not offer his cheek? Because he wasn't willing to suffer at that point? But he was willing. He was willing to give his life for that person. And that's what he did on the cross. But in that moment, Augustine says, it was better for the servant to be rebuked and to be reprimanded. It was better for that person to be challenged by Jesus. It was better than offering the other cheek at that moment. So that's Augustine's point. He says there is something like misbehavement that provokes and that indicates that person needs betterment, maybe even through violence. But that violence has always to be restricted by the idea that the person who punishes, who does the punishing, should not act out of anger, but out of concern for the person that is to be punished. So that's the right intention. So if you exert violence, never do it out of anger, but do it for the betterment, for love of that person that is going to receive the punishment.
About passion as suffering. It's very good to have resourceful to go back to St. Thomas and to Augustine always. What do you say about our future reflection about, let's say, sorrow or passions? Because I'm thinking regarding passion or sorrow, nowadays we are hearing already in the Mass, "Oh Jerusalem, comfort, comfort Jerusalem. You have already suffered double, have inflicted double." Sometimes we are taught, or in my readings I discovered that sorrow or punishment itself is already a means of salvation. They are already indicators that we are not doomed. That's one side. The other side is, since the philosopher Nietzsche, he said, God is dead, man is free. Somehow is that, that's why he teaches Superman. You live passionately. What I'm thinking here is sometimes maybe the passions breaks the boundary established by reason. Sometimes, of course, we under good reason. Is it the case that there are times reason builds up a kind of imprisonment, imprisons the person? And theologically we say God is ever greater. So all our conceptions in the end should be demolished in order for us to see God. Is that some kind of direction? What do you say, in short, what do you say about the future of our reflection about passion or sorrow? Thank you.
Yeah, but the future of our reflection, let me say just this much. I think there is really something to the idea that our actions should be guided by reason and not by the passions. Or at least that reason should make the judgment whether an act that I would like to do by my passions is really allowed to be done, whether it's a morally good act or a bad act. Why is that? That is because passions tend to be egoistic. I think passions tend to be egoistic. So in passions, our nature, our will to live, let's say, our will to survive, which makes us the center of the world. And I think passions serve that self-centering attitude, because our most basic passions like hunger and the thirst and all that, they have to do with self-preservation. Self-preservation, and that's what animals also do. So that's part of human nature, and that always has to do with our tendency for self-centering, so making ourselves and our well-being and our survival the most important issue. Now, Augustine thinks that is original sin. That is original sin, our tendency towards self-centering. And all he works for and all he writes for is the idea of we have to break through that self-centering and open ourselves up and make God the center of everything. And if we do that, then we will regain ourselves, but not in a self-centering way, but in a way that makes God the center. And if we make God the center, we will also gain the others in a new way. We will be able to love our fellow human beings in a new way. We will no longer make them the instruments of our self-centering, letting them serve our interests. No, we will truly be able to love each other. And that's why I think there is something too that already ancient critique of the passions, because the passions tend to serve the self-centering, the self-serving interests that we as animals do have. Human being, animal rationale, the animal part of that. That's the self-serving part. We want to live, we want to survive, we want pleasure, so we want the best things for ourselves. And I think I don't think that in the passions there is the capacity of criticizing that attitude. But in reason it is. In reason there is the capacity of criticizing that attitude. And that is why I think we should keep the superiority of reason to the passions.
I'm afraid time is up. Many thanks to Professor Brachtendorf for his inspiring talk and answers. It is the first time you are here. I hope it is not the last time. It will be another time. We have a little souvenir for Professor since he is very interested in enculturation. So we present a souvenir, a Chinese painting. I hope you like it.